good to be alive in this land of ours. Good to drive in this land of ours.
Hello, Canada hockey fans in the United States.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hockey Time Machine. I'm Glenn Dreyfus. One programming note, stick around at the end of our program, please. We're going to talk about a nice tribute that Mark Curtin, our buddy, got this week. We'll do that at the end of the show. I'll be the first to admit, I used to think Corsi was something you dealt with at restaurants, you know, like chicken or fish for your main Corsi. And that Fenwick was the baseball field where the Red Sox play. Now I know better, and you do too, that Corsi and Fenwick are pioneering ways to measure hockey performance. You may love analytics, you may not love analytics, but no matter the sport these days, you ignore analytics at your own peril. That goes for players, it goes for coaches, for managers, and for fans, too. What we're going to do tonight will definitely not be a dry recitation of formulas and numbers. We're going to demystify how analytics are used and how maybe they're not being used and should be. And to do that, we welcome back to Hockey Time Machine a former NHL captain, former NHL general manager, and a team consultant, Jerry Meehan. Welcome back to Hockey Time Machine, Jerry.
Great to be here, Glenn. Thanks for including me. This is going to be a great show, I think.
To put this in the proper context, I'm going to first have you frame what our discussion is going to be about, what analytics are and what they're not and how they can be used and how we don't yet know how to use them.
Well, that's a big question and one that requires multiple aspects of the answer, but I think the best way to think of analytics is to go back to the basics of hockey statistics. Hockey statistics began in the earliest stages, obviously, with the simple things: goals, assists, penalty minutes, saves, wins, losses, etc. And that became the standard by which you judge both individual and team performance. Somewhere along the way, somebody came up with some ideas about doing new levels or creating new rates of assessing performance, and included something called enhanced statistics, which includes what you mentioned, Corsi and Fenwick and a number of other ones that I'm sure we'll talk about. But the fact is that analytics and the analysis of information is nothing different than what it's been done before. The difference is it's become a computerized process. And that process doesn't end with the human mind thinking about the ways to look at statistics. It adds that feature of high-speed scientific computational values to add more dimension to it and, in fact, increase the amount of information. But the most important thing to remember is statistics, now called advanced stats or analytics, really is the concluding process that begins with the most basic type of approach, which in the old days was done with our own computers called our brains.
Now, there are different stakeholder groups within the hockey universe that use advanced stats in very different ways. Can you tell us about those different stakeholder groups, the media, the fans, the leagues, others, and how they use the numbers?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. Most of the people who pay attention to this, who are team result oriented or thinking about how teams use it. But analytics today, the process, computational science process, has expanded well beyond on-field, on ice, on-court performance, and into the whole world of sports management. It starts at the very top of an organization with the management group that runs arenas and teams and events. It filters down into the operations group where people there are in charge of running the facility itself and making sure that there's safe access and different values attached to the facility. But the biggest area these days is twofold. One is fan engagement and event management. Beyond the team's performance itself, fan engagement and event management are both huge parts of the analytics world these days. Fan engagement meaning, what do you give the fans who consume your product other than just watching games at the event itself? How do you engage them after the event, between games, in the parking lot, waiting to get into the arena? All these different things are ways now, analytic ways to keep the fans interested in the product and anticipating the outcomes of the game. Not to mention, of course, what's coming soon in the gaming world, which really is something that's going to be extraordinary. And the other is event management, obviously. Clubs and teams and organizations need to understand how they can plan the use of their facility. If you're running an arena or a stadium or a baseball field with one tenant, you're looking at a 365 event day, but you're probably only, in hockey is the case, you're getting about 45 to 50 events depending on playoffs out of an entire calendar year. So you have to find a way to get the events in the facility that will also use up that dark time or downtime. And a lot of this planning is done through an analytic process that is really quite sophisticated these days.
You mentioned gaming, and for better or worse, sports leagues have all aligned with betting operations, and advanced metrics are a part of that. And how do you see that playing out?
Well, the interesting thing when you attach it to fan engagement is it allows your fans to be engaged not just in the game on the ice, but individual events called prop bets that allows them to bet on the outcome of, for example, a shootout. For example, you could bet on the outcomes of a shootout, or you might bet on who's going to score the first goal in the third period, or you might bet on the first visiting team player to get hit in a baseball game. This is the area that combines gaming with fan engagement so that fans are attached to the outcomes of the game on individual space and time events, not just who won or lost.
From a legal perspective, since you are a lawyer, is there any concern that advanced metrics might be used to manipulate in-game outcomes?
There is definitely an issue there. And the other side of that coin is, can you count on the advanced metric information to make your bet? Is it timely? There was a recent lawsuit started against one of the big sports betting online groups that somebody lost money on a bet, and the claim against the company was that their information, and it was on a prop bet about an individual short-term event within a game, the information on that particular odds for that outcome were delayed in getting to the person who made the bet and then lost the money. So yes, there's all kinds of legal implications, not to mention the human and emotional issues that come with losing money betting on games and events over which you have no control or no likelihood of being able to ultimately predict correct outcomes.
If you'll put on your general manager hat now, Jerry, I want to focus on how analytics is deployed in team management operations. You've identified 4 general areas of application: player identification, player acquisition, player retention, and team coach performance. So Let's take those one at a time. Player identification, and regarding the entry draft, how do analytics factor into what you describe as the 5 different points of contact with a prospect?
Well, I think that's where the question or the answer starts, is with the 5 different points of access of information. And how does analytics and the advanced metric calculations fit into that particular decision? You have live scouting, video scouting, interviews of the players, interviews of the coaches and parents and everything else. And then you have the analytics. It's a balanced approach for all 5. Now, in some cases, analytics may be more important than others because you might not have seen a particular player in as much as you might have wanted to, and you need another support for something. For example, if you've got a player who catches the eye of a scout in a small league in northern Saskatchewan, and he calls in a report that says this guy's got to be seen, you might only see him once or twice a year. And if there's any analytic sources for that information, it would really be helpful to refine your knowledge of that player. But I think analytics can really help in the later rounds of the draft, where clubs don't have as much information about players later in the draft than they might have had for players who are more highly rated. And secondly, analytics is very useful in terms of identifying specific types of players. Everybody knows who the really good players are. There's no shortage of information about that. And, you know, the early round draft picks are pretty obvious, and the information is all there for everybody to use. And in those cases, the personal interviews become really important. But later in the draft, kids that don't go to the draft, kids that aren't interviewed directly at the time or haven't seen as much, but have some special skill that may be attractive to a team, whether it's a great skater with great defensive skills or a special goalie that you don't want to miss a chance on. This is where analytics can really be helpful.
Can analytics be helpful when you're talking about players that are as young as teenagers? Can you still trust the numbers that you see with players that young?
But Len, I think that's an area that really has to be explored yet. I mean, I'm not so sure that I'm the one that can answer that question, just because I'm not day-to-day involved in what clubs are doing with those kinds of decisions. But there's no question that an 18-year-old draft brings special challenges as opposed to a draft of football players who might have played 3 or 4 years of high-level competitive football in the NCAA. 18-year-old players have to be assessed not just on what they've done before they get drafted, but what you expect will happen shortly after they get drafted. How about how much they're going to grow? The analysis, how their physical conditioning, all these kinds of things have to be looked into. But it's much more difficult to use analytics for players to be identified and brought into an organization at 18 than it is to assess pros that you're trying to evaluate for perhaps trades or free agent decisions.
The next category you identified was player acquisition. So please talk about that.
Player acquisition is the next step. And when we mention those 4 topics, we're not talking about things that stand in isolation from each other. It's a spectrum or a process. Player identification flows into player acquisition. So the identification side of it in the draft and the amateur side is what's the universe of possible picks. The acquisition side of that is your ultimate decision and what you use to make your decision to acquire a particular player. And in the draft, you got 7 chances, and I guess right now 7 rounds. So you better be pretty sure of what you're doing. In the nature of professional side, acquisition really ends up being assessing where a player who's already a pro might fit into your organization, whether that player is worthy of being acquired, and whether or not the price may or may not be too high.
And that is even more crucial in a salary cap environment, because we talked off camera about the Maple Leafs, for instance, who have 4 players who eat up $40 million. And so the Leafs are an example of a team that have to be especially good and have a very high hit rate on filling out the rest of the roster with players who won't be valued as highly.
Well, this is a really important point. The salary cap controls to a far greater degree the roster makeup of teams than it did 20, 30 years ago when I was really active in it. The salary cap dictates what you have to spend, but the market determines how much you're going to spend for a particular player. And then the market is a very interesting concept because markets in sports are often confused with general market in terms of the absolute value or intrinsic value of a player's performance versus that particular player's category within the structure of a salary cap organization. To use the Leafs as an example, they have 3 or 4 very high-level players who are paid within what we would call the general and appropriate range for players of that caliber. And when you've spent that much money on those players because you have done a good job of identifying and acquiring them, you have to deploy your financial assets in a different way. Analytics really helps to articulate players who fit into those other categories, which we won't call them top 3, top 6 players. We'll just talk about, the frontline players, the depth players, and the mid-tier players who play really important roles. And I think we've seen in recent years championship teams do an exceptionally good job of filling in those slots for their mid-tier and third-tier players to support the stars in their lineup very, very well. And that seems to be a really important aspect for this process these days for clubs, which is use the analytics to find the right guy that fits the right slot for your team with the money you have to spend.
In fact, you've talked about the fact that maybe the idea of first line, second line, third line, fourth line, that's outdated, and that we should be thinking more, or teams should be more, in terms of scoring line, checking line, lines that have different purposes, rather than saying, well, these are my 3 best players and these are my next 3 best, and so on.
Yeah, you can't play your best players for 60 minutes. And this is one of the things. There is this fascination with star players, which is well deserved because they are great athletes and really worth watching. But they can't play 60 minutes in a game. And so you have a whole another 40 minutes of ice time to allocate them on different players. And if you're talking about forwards versus defensemen, you've got 4 forwards for the Leafs who are going to eat up a certain amount of ice time, and you have to find the right numbers of players to fill the rest. But it's not just a less capable player skill-wise than the player ahead of him. It's a person who plays a particular role. Your face-off specialists, your possession guys, your defensemen and control outcomes. You can think of them in every roster of a team if you're a fan. But the idea here is that your roster needs to be built around the needs and the expectations of the industry within that financial structure. You can't just have a team that's basically populated by high-level skilled players and players who are rated on that team because they're a little less skillful than the guys ahead of them. They have to play different roles.
And of course, metrics can also help you identify what you may have to make in terms of adjustments within a particular game or a particular playoff series. If you've got to spend a lot of the second period on the penalty kill, well, your scoring line just won't be on the ice, so you better have the right people identified.
Well, it's interesting. That's a good point, because if you've got this in-game situations, you need to have players on your roster that can move up or down the lineup depending upon the situation. if you lose your key player to your key playoff shooter for a power play guy to an injury in the first period, you got to have a person ready to step in to do, if not as well as your primary shooter, but somebody who could at least perform as well within the power play unit to replace that person, to not lose that aspect of your game for the entire rest of the game. So there's really a push these days, in my mind, towards finding those players, what I call mid-tier players, that can move up into more prominent positions offensively and defensively in certain circumstances, but are very comfortable in sitting in their mid-tier roles if everything is going well.
An example of how metrics may alter the impression of a certain player, even one considered a star. In the hockey news, data cruncher Jack Fraser explained how advanced metrics poked holes in the game of a former Norris Trophy winner. Microstats revealed that this defenseman, said Fraser, quote, he wasn't allowing a lot of shots, but the shots he was allowing were really, really good ones, dangerous ones. So let's talk about how this relates to category 3 of yours, player retention, and of course, player non-retention, based on those metrics, which may be different than the eye test.
Well, you can't isolate on one metric and use it as the standard by which you judge the effectiveness of the player. I would remind anybody who thought of that comment that Norris Trophy winners are not picked because they have an inefficiency or an efficiency in one particular area. There's way more to it, and this indicates the harm of using a single metric to isolate on a negative that overrides the perception that's proper that this is a really good player. There is no perfect hockey player. I'm sorry, it doesn't exist. There are players who are more perfect than others or closer to it, but everybody has a flaw, and everybody has a flaw that can be exploited to a limit. But people with major awards don't have many flaws, and if that's one that's been identified, I'm sure it's compensated with many other qualities.
Have you ever thought about how advanced metrics might have changed your game during your playing days?
Well, I don't think of that at all. Really, I haven't, but it's a good question. We were probably categorized as particular types of players intuitively by the hockey people. And in those days, I mean, your reference point was your goals, your assists, your other statistics, and whether the team was winning or losing with you. If the team was winning with you and you were filling a proper role, there was no need for really much analytics. But I think intuitively, the game at that point didn't have all the information. So you make a mention of the so-called coach's feeling or intuition. That was a big part of decision making, but I still say we're better off today with the analytic process being in support of the intuition of the hockey guys.
Am I right that in contract negotiations, there's a real limit on how much analytics can be used? How does that factor or not factor in?
I think it's really a good question. Contract negotiation needs to be separated from what we call preparation for arbitration. Contract negotiation in hockey is all based upon, obviously market demand and the value of a player based upon his category and how he fits within the salary cap. But the idea that the arbitration rules are the same as negotiation rules, I think, is a little bit archaic or not quite true. You can argue any point in contract negotiations you wish, and if the other side chooses to be influenced by it, as long as it's not a lie, then that's just called persuasion. But once you get into arbitration, and every contract negotiation in certain categories is preparation for a possible arbitration. And if that arbitration comes up, you can only use certain limited statistics. And it's very important to understand that it's a very objective process. The statistics you can use are those that are called official NHL statistics, and people can see what they are on NHL.com. But also the idea that it's an objective process that's meant to produce an objective outcome, not a subjective outcome, which one of the reasons why there's no testimonials or press clippings allowed as evidence in arbitration, because it is opinion and not, it's subjective opinion and not objectively presented proof of a particular skill or ability.
If I was really being a nitpicker or pest, and you can tell I'm being that because I'm going fuzzy here, I'd say what's objective and what's subjective may be in the eye of the beholder too.
Well, I suppose, but if you look at the list, and you can look at it if you pursue it, if you wish to pursue it, but the list is pretty objective. It is, and the approved statistical categories are collectively bargained or agreed to by both players and management, because the subjective side can work in your favor or against you, because a subjective argument that falls on deaf ears or as unrealistic is a loser. So you're always encouraged in these kinds of situations to use the proofs, the evidences that you have access to that are official and recognized generally within the industry as worthwhile. And trying to sneak in extraneous information really is inappropriate, and probably one of the reasons why there are so few arbitrations when people file for them ultimately is that they do reach a negotiated settlement to their dispute before it goes to an arbitrator, because they've used the objective standards at the conclusion of the process to come to a meeting of the minds.
Your category 4, where the rubber of analytics really meets the road in terms of player performance and coaching. And there's so many categories, some of which I know about, some of which are proprietary. High danger passes, zone entries and exits, zone starts, quality of teammates and competition. And amazingly, even luck is factored in, a metric known as PDO. So take the next 7 hours or so and go through all of that for us.
Well, I'd love to be able to go category by category, but I think that's expected. That's too much to be expected. But here's the team performance and coach performance aspect of analytics stands somewhat distinct from the other three, in that a general manager uses the first three in preparation for competition, but the last one, the team coach performance, is basically an in-season process, and that's something you're doing on a game-by-game basis. Now, there's two aspects to that. One is the manager's approach to viewing the outcomes of games and whether or not the processes are working the way he hopes they would, and the other is the coach's use of the information. And I think coaches tend to be, I don't want to use this as any, I don't have any proof of this, but the idea that coaches are more or less analytic, I think needs to be considered. I've talked to coaches, and we've interviewed coaches within the program who have basically said to them, well, like once I'm in the game, I'm just into the game, and I'm managing my bench like a coach, and I'm not really referring to anything analytic. Now, there is some change there, which involves this player tracking technology, which I think itself has some great value, but also possible abuses. But if you can use the player tracking technology to assess individual players or performances during the game, which I highly question the ability to do that, but maybe I'm wrong, but between periods to show and demonstrate trends in the game. But hockey is a very, very fast game. I'm not so sure. I'm not aware of anybody that I've talked to who could say they can actually stop the mind of intuition of coaching a game and say all of a sudden, okay, we're going to go to the analytics model on this decision or this bench change.
I think what you've mentioned to me in the past is that if you can use analytics to help you practice in a certain way, then the hope is that once you get to the game, you won't have to spend time thinking about it.
Well, think about how you would do that. You would do it in relation to not just patterns of play or practice activities that are involved zone play or defensive play, but think of it in terms of managing players' conditioning. How much ice time can a player handle during a game that means he needs to not practice very hard the next day? Because in hockey, as we know, they basically play 2.5 games a week on average, or basically 5 games in every 2 weeks, or 10 games a month, or a little more than that in the busy months. So there really isn't a lot of time between games for them to do any kind of intensive practice. Years ago, before all the other busyness and there were fewer teams, you might have 2 or 3 days between games where coaches might be able to dig in and do some real drills and conditioning programs and so on. But these days, the analytics, and especially on the physiology side, can be used very effectively to measure physical performance and need for rest and what we call load management. Load management is a big part of it these days. And we actually interviewed on our program one of my favorite people, Craig Ramsey, who talked about how he managed the ice time for players on the Boston Bruins in one of their really runs to the Stanley Cup or the finals, whatever it was. And he said he found that if he reduced some star players' ice time, it improved their efficiency dramatically. And it was over the opposition of the player, because the player said, "Get me out there, coach, I'm ready." And the coach knew that he wasn't ready, but he was ready to go because the adrenaline's flowing and the desire to compete never stops. But that's one way of using it now. Instead of just having the coaches feel for that, they can actually measure it and discover and get into the patterns of analyzing a player's physiological performance through a schedule, including practice and game.
I'm asking you to generalize, but do you think that if players can be shown the numbers, do you think in a general sense this has created more buy-in with the players, that you can actually show them that their performance can be improved or their performance may dropped off, that they'll be more likely to say, okay, I won't ask you for so many zone starts in the offensive end?
Yeah, I think that the players, if you use the displays, these biometric, you see them on the iPads at the bench looking at the things. You can use it very effectively to show deficiencies in play, both team and individuals. Today, the game is so fast, and there's this whole idea of gap control. And these visual depictions on the iPad of minimizing the distance the players have to go to intercept the puck or create this intense combat situation all over the ice is very useful, I think. But today's game is all fast-paced. It's immediate, and players have to be ready for the next shift. So yes, I think it's helpful, but I'm yet to be able to see where it's going to be used more extensive than what we're seeing now. And some coaches think it's a distraction on the bench too.
I'd like to take a deeper dive into what you touched on, which is the technical innovation that is advancing the next generation of analytics. As you said, it's called puck and player tracking. And the director of research for the Penguins, Sam Ventura, called puck and player tracking, quote, a generational game changer. So go over, if you would, for us, what puck and player tracking is and what you think of it? Is it a game changer, something less? How much should we lean on puck and player tracking?
Well, what I don't want to get people away from with this discussion, or even the focus on analytics, is anything you produce that is an assessment value for performance on the ice, first of all, needs to be considered from the point of view of the hockey experienced person. Hockey experience is invaluable in this whole process of the 5 elements we mentioned about player identification. And the idea that you can assign a chore to somebody with high-level technical skills to make an assessment about an in-game activity who may never have seen the surface of an ice rink other than from a distance while looking at a computer or through a TV screen, probably is not giving the process enough weight from the point of view of the hockey experienced person. So I like to make sure that people understand that analytics is something that's delivered, in my view, to people who make decisions based upon their own experience in the game, usually playing it, mostly playing it, but sometimes playing at different levels in the NHL. Now, as to the player tracking side of it, I think I don't know whether it's a generational game changer. I don't know what that means, but player tracking will do things that probably we couldn't have done before. Are they as important in game as they're important for game prep? They're probably more important for game preparation and player conditioning than they are for in-game assessment, although you can use them if they're well managed between periods, obviously, to make changes or responses to as the game's ebb and flow proceeds. But I'm waiting for more information on that, specifically, Glenn, to find out where this is going to take us. And really, it's such a new thing right now, and in many cases, the collective bargaining agreements have to be modified to reflect how it's going to be used and who's going to be okay with it.
For those who don't know, every player on the ice has a computer chip folded into their sweater, and infrared cameras at the top of the rink take the information from where those players are skating, as well as the puck, which also has a chip in it. And all of this information is sent back to a company in Durham, North Carolina, to be processed, and then is sent back to the teams as well as the TV trucks and the internet sites. And that's the whole technical end of it. And it's a brand new toy. And you know, Jerry, how brand new toys are. When you have one, you want to use it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not, and I'm very positive about the possibilities. I just don't know enough about it yet, and haven't had a chance to study it to make a comment on it that would be considered in any way reliable. I'm open-minded to it. I think it has great value potentially. It also has the potential for abuse, because if you use it to identify player weakness, the next step is to use it to identify savings on your salary cap, because you can point to that weakness as a support for reduce the amount of money you have to pay a particular player. So I think it's still something that we have to pay attention to. We have to be open-minded about it and see where it goes. And I think this season probably will be the first season since it's been incorporated where it really is going to start gathering the momentum it's hoped to have.
I found what I consider to be a fascinating actual use of advanced metrics to confirm what, in retrospect, is a common sense thing. And it comes from the world of baseball, which I know you're also involved in. This is a quote from Buck Showalter, the manager of the New York Mets. And he talked about how his team has changed its pregame routine. Quote, "You could ask why they don't take infield and outfield practice. Well, it's been proven that it's stupid." You're getting your arm ready for batting practice. Then you get your arm ready for infield. Then you go inside, get cold again, and then get it ready for the game. That was proven to be a really bad idea. So,
Proven by what? Proven by analytics, proven that they weren't ready to play a game, or proven that they were tired. I think more has to be thought through on that question. But part of being an athlete is having a routine. And part of maximizing performance is having a routine that gets you ready to compete. And whether it's baseball or football or hockey, there are routines. And in my mind, the reason for a pregame skate or a pregame infield practice or batting might be is all about the psychological process of preparing to compete. And athlete physiology and mentality is all about rising to the occasion. And if anything will help you rise to that occasion, I think it is proper preparation. And if it's proper preparation based upon playing a little game an hour before the game, or a pregame skate, I mean, talk about a pregame skate. You're in the morning, you go out there and you skate for 45 minutes, and then you go home and go to sleep. And then get up again and go out and have a pregame warm and go into the bench and sit there for half an hour before the game starts. It's all part of the process. I would not get rid of any of it. It's part of the athlete preparation.
Interesting. I want to quote Ian Anderson, the Flyers director of hockey analytics. He reminds us that back in the 1980s, ice time, for instance, was calculated with a TV set, a VCR, a stopwatch, and a notepad. Today, Ian has an analytics staff of 5 full-time employees, a whole department. So that leads me to this. How are analytics used by the less visible members of a team, the scouting staff, the medical staff, and so on? And if you would, as part of that answer, you're looking at post-playing careers using some of those analytics, and maybe you can talk to me about what you're doing in forming a program in that regard.
Sure. Well, the interesting you mentioned that question, because I was a co-founder of a company that created the first medical record system for professional sports teams. And that program was built around the idea of information management through a computerized process that connected all of the information users within an athlete's care. The trainers, the coach, the manager, the doctors, the specialists, the therapists, the nutritionists, all had limited or direct access to that information, with the view of making sure that everybody knows what the path of the athlete is. Now, especially after an injury, if you're talking about medical stuff, huge aspects of medical analytics these days on return to play decisions. I mean, these are multi-million-dollar decisions. And we all know the story of a return to play player in Buffalo who recently went through this process. And I'm sure that the club's decision making on that basis was largely based upon the general knowledge and analysis of not only the physician's specialty knowledge and training and years of experience, but also medical informatics about the nature of the injury and the likelihood of returns to play. Because, as I said, multi-million-dollar decisions are based upon that. Trainers will use it to manage healthcare for their players. Stick manufacturers will use it for all the obvious reasons. The scouts are using a combination of analytics and regular statistics to prepare for games. I used to say to scouts, before they even saw a game, I said, you can probably figure out who to watch without even going to the first game of the season. Just get the statistics from last year and find out what the different players do. And if you dig into a statistical profile of player, you can tell a lot by just doing that analysis. So it's very useful in a lot of different ways. and the care and feeding of athletes and preparing for competition and for recovery is an essential part of it for sure.
And speak to me some more about the care and feeding of athletes when their career is over. You've been working on a program to keep them active and engaged in the sport with careers once they hang them up.
Yeah, in recent years, I've become very interested in identifying issues and the needs of retired players and former players. And one of the key areas that we focused on is education and healthcare and retirement planning. On the education side, in association with the University of Buffalo's law schools, at Center for the Advancement of Sport and Professor Nellie Drew, and the engineering department, their computational science group under Dr. Bruce Pittman, we have built a 4-course program focusing on not just on former players, but built around the idea that former players, when they come out of the game, they might want to just stay in the game, and the whole program is designed to educate them on how to work in sports, where the jobs are, and how to get back into the world of sports after their playing days are over. Now, the other people we have to give some notification or notoriety to is the Professional Hockey Players Association. Larry Landon, the executive director, and Steve Carney, the director of career transition for the PHPA, have both been instrumental in helping us build this program. And we're deploying these 4 courses through their membership over the next course. And by the end of the year, we should have a program complete and ready to go. So this is all part of the process of helping players. Once they finish playing in the game, there's a place for them to go to understand what it's like to work in the game beyond the ice, and also where the jobs are and what they need to know to work at a job effectively in the game.
Is this something that you would have to be in the Buffalo area to access, or are you envisioning this as an online course?
Yeah, this was begun in its earliest iteration, was going to be a classroom program, but the reality is that the membership of this category, this community, is all over the world now, and to expect them to travel into a classroom setting would be unrealistic. So we've set it up in a way that we can reproduce the classroom experience and give them the quality of information and education they need with full university credit for the courses they take, so that they can apply those courses to other schools that they might be attending, or they can just walk away with their certificate of completion and look for their first job in the business.
A bit off topic, but you've been an adjunct professor. I'm wondering how you took to that, whether you liked it and whether it liked you.
Well, I guess the combination of curiosity and a need to keep learning. I've always been kind of this curious type about things that are sports oriented, competition oriented, and education oriented. And it was my goal always after playing to complete my education, which I did. And when I basically got to a certain elevated age, shall we say, I realized I still had something to give, I think, to the industry itself and to the people in it. And, you know, it's knowledge that's gained from over 50 years of activity in sports and now education. So, but it needs to be focused on towards a particular need. And I do believe that a lot of these athletes coming out of their game, whether they retire before they fulfill their dream or after they've played a few years or after have had superstar careers, I think you'll always find that after the last goal is scored and the rink shuts down for them competitively, there's still going to be a gap in their lives which requires education and retraining.
Back to the data, like any industry, In hockey, there's the statistics that the public gets to see, and then there's the ones that are proprietary for the teams. So without giving away any company secrets, what are the types of team numbers that only they get to see that the public doesn't?
I think it's more about what the process the teams deploy that is not available to the public, rather than just the basic information. Today, there are all kinds of websites and articles. I follow The Athletic, which does a good job on information management. I'm a fan of Cap Friendly, which is probably the most complete reference tool in a computerized fashion for NHL information. I'm a subscriber to a group called Evolving Hockey that does do some real, essential computational stuff. But in the teams themselves, those that have created the analytics department, they're engaged in using computational science to support decision making beyond just bare statistics. They're coming up with scenarios. I can't get into the scientific or computer science terminology much, because we should have somebody else who to do that. But if you take a reference point to the ability of the data science to be filtered, sorted, clustered, and gathered in ways that allows you to hyper-identify on specific outcomes for your decision making, it's highly useful. And I don't see much of that in the public, and clubs who have come up with what you mentioned are proprietary methods of using data within their computational process to make recommendations to the general manager and coaches for decision making are very much in play. An example might be if a club has $4 million on the salary cap and they've got 3 hockey positions to fill, and one of them is a defenseman, one's a left winger, and one's a centerman who can take faceoffs and check. These are categories that can be sorted through a clustering method that allows them to identify all of the players that might fall within a general range of those with those statistics that support that particular player, which allows the general manager then to focus on a very small group of highly skilled or highly oriented towards that decision making than maybe historically, where you might be using the entire reserve list of another NHL team to figure out your solution.
And then after all that, it has to mesh with the philosophy of a team. Do you want a speedy team? Do you want a heavy team? So that's part of deciding how to use the information you have.
Yeah, I think that's the point too, Glenn. Is that when you look at, there used to be something in business in the world we call benchmarking. How do you decide how your team stacks up against the rest of the world? What I would do in my day as a manager, before the computational science processes arrived, we would do basically a whiteboard analysis of our entire reserve list, and we'd have lists of players alphabetically and by position and by age and all these different things. But it was all paper-based, and it was binders full of information. Now you can have this system, the computerized system, sort through all the different variables to give you, I focus on a particular, give me the top 10 left wingers in the Atlantic Conference who played 12 minutes a game and were plus players and took faceoffs. That's how refined it can get if you want it to. And the general manager and their staff will often work with the analytics guys to come up with those kinds of solutions. And one of the areas that's very helpful, you can sort all the trades for the last whatever number of years to find out what's fair value for a player. You can sort all the contract information through an analytic process allows you to get contract information instantaneously rather than having to go through multiple steps to get it. So it's fascinating, and it is exciting to see the ability that clubs have now to absorb and digest and utilize information.
And it is necessary to absorb and digest because Oracle's big data blog estimated that within one 60-minute hockey game with the puck and player tracking system, there are now, quote, roughly 9,360,000 logged events generated per category. And then you add up all the categories, you add up all the games. Talk about a data dump to sift through.
Man, I could only imagine what they might be, but if you're talking about every millions of events in each category, boy, you're narrowing it down to the narrowest possible parameter, including maybe whether the sock and the skate or the equipment malfunction happened that led to a goal or something along that line. So I'm overwhelmed with the thought.
There's also what you have categorized as, this puts it much more simply, the difference between good statistics and bad statistics. A hockey data expert named Garrett Hole put it this way, quote, "We know stats like hits are mostly random and meaningless, but there's probably teams that are looking at them. So you really do have to figure out what matters and maybe what doesn't."
Well, it's interesting that it really leads to this kind of thought that says it's not so much the data you use, but the question you ask the data to answer. Because if you ask the wrong question, the data will never give you the right answer. So if you're looking at hits, the question for hits is not whether or not a hit was made, but whether or not it was an effective hit that led to a possession change, or whether or not it was a useless hit that took the player who made the hit out of the play because the guy was just grazed and he got back in the play, and now there's an odd man rush up the ice the other way. Hits can't be thought of as hits. They have to be thought of situationally, like most things in hockey. I mean, they talk about Fenwick versus Corsi, block shots and non-block shots. There's a whole level of analysis behind that stat that we could go into if you want. But the general idea is this is a starting point, not the final answer for what the stats will mean, because the question has to be asked, what is the use for it? What are you trying to decide? Not just the blanket use of stats for a general indicator.
And to crunch all this data, teams, at least not all of them, are doing this all in-house. There's universities and outside companies involved, right? So this is becoming a third-party business as well.
I think that in the early stages of the adoption of analytics, there were companies that would provide the information to clubs. But more and more, I think we're seeing clubs taking that in-house, hiring their own staff. As you mentioned, Sam Ventura now in Buffalo is a vice president of analytics and computational data analysis, which was basically turned a kind of a sideline position into an executive level job for a sports organization. So this means if you're bringing true scientists into your organization, you're doing the science in-house, not hiring it out.
Do you think there's still a digital divide among NHL teams? Are some still much better at sifting through the data and getting at what's important, and others not? Just like some teams are better, have better players and better coaches.
I was going to say, some teams have better power plays than others. Some teams have better goalies. Some teams have better analytics departments. I'm sure that's the case. A lot of it's driven too by the general manager's attitude towards it. The general manager digs in and says, I'm into this within the proper balance. I keep coming to that word balance. It's not standalone stuff. None of these things are standalone. It's the balance approach. Some clubs will weigh their information more in the direction of live scouting than of analytics. Some put more weight on personal interviews than on a video scouting. So yeah, there are teams that are better at it than others.
To back up that point, and this is from 2015, so admittedly 7 years ago, but ESPN.com identified that just one NHL team at that time that they put in the category of non-believers when it came to analytics. And this team's coach said, quote, "I never look at statistics. I just go with the feelings," as you mentioned earlier. Now, that coach was Patrick Roy, and the team was the Colorado Avalanche. So I can only imagine that they must have gone through some kind of attitude adjustment between then and when they won the Stanley Cup a few months ago.
Yeah, I think that's just an indicator. Patrick's a great guy, great hockey guy, but you know, he is of the school of that probably would have the weight of their decision making and their attitude towards the game more towards tradition than towards the innovations that are coming along. And I think that, you know, these things are they're not just happening, they're inevitable to be an integral part of operating sports teams. And there's more to it than the fact that it's now accepted. It's the fact that it's almost expected. I think the change in league leadership and the change in ownership and the change in management of different clubs, there's a new breed of owner in the leagues now that are highly business oriented and in many cases analytic oriented. And I would expect, although I've never asked anybody this question, but I would expect that they view this as something the organizations need and should be using. Now, that also brings up the question of whether or not it can be overused. And there have been teams that cut back in their budgets on in-person scouting and relied heavily on analytics. And those teams are in the non-playoff drought for a long time, recovering from those decisions. So I don't think you can just say it's a blanket move towards analytics as the dominant factor. It's a blend and a balance for sure.
As far as you know, do players have access to the same analytics, the proprietary ones, all the numbers that the teams have, or is that for the management only?
I would say that the players do not have a role in the actual calculation process. I would say they're given information that results from the calculation process. But if you take a specific example, I don't think the coaches would ever go to a player or the manager go to a player and say, "Help me figure out who the best left winger is to replace you." So I think the players, players play the game, coaches coach it, managers manage, owners own, and the balance, the boundaries are not as tightly drawn as they used to be, but they're still there.
Let's finish on this conversation today, and we very much appreciate you joining us. What's the future as you see it of analytics? And I know there's no real way to predict, but let's frame it this way, where would you like to see analytics going as a part of the game going forward?
I like what I see right now with these 5 elements of player evaluation and player acquisition and player retention. It's much more challenging to make a decision for a player with no track record, as in the amateur draft, especially after the early rounds, than it is to make an assessment of a player who is well established in their career or reaching the end of the career. But I think that the balance is something we need to keep pursuing. I think the use of analytics is only as limited, as restrictive as the imagination of the people who run teams and who figured out questions to ask the data.
Very good. Well, you, Jerry, have shined a light on a lot of areas that are crucial to our game, but that a lot of times we don't spend a lot of time thinking about or realize how important it is. And you actually did it in a way that I can understand, so I appreciate that.
Well, we'll one of these days we'll do one where we'll bring in the scientists as well, who can totally confuse us if I didn't.
Well, with your permission, we won't be done with you, and perhaps in another month or so, we can go over another topic of interest to you in terms of general managing and a lot of topics we haven't touched on yet, because you are very good at illuminating a lot of the sports management end of things that we don't get to be inside those rooms very much, and we appreciate it.
Well, I think that's my goal, really, Glenn, is to help people understand, without giving away any proprietary information, that the game on the ice, as exciting as it is backed by a whole fascinating world of activity and for participants, highly skilled and very committed to making the game better. So I'm happy to join you at your request and with a little bit of notice whenever.
Very good. Thank you, Jerry.
Thanks, Glenn. Great to be with you.
Laura, if you will bring me back full screen now, I would appreciate it, because we want to close today with a word about Mark Curtin, friend of Hockey Time Machine, former NHL defenseman. He's battling ALS and putting all his energy these days into finding a cure for himself and all ALS sufferers. The Toronto Maple Leafs Alumni Association just presented Mark with the Carl Brewer Memorial Award, quote, for his dedicated service to the community to end ALS forever. Here's a portion of a YouTube video which was just released.
I hope and pray that I will be around for my daughter's graduation and my son's wedding. And that our government will finally recognize ALS and help the cause by not only fast-tracking the drugs to get into our bodies as quick as possible, but finding a cure.
One of the true gentlemen of the game of hockey, Mark Curtin, a former Toronto Maple Leaf, who needs you on his team.
A former teammate, Mark Curtin, from the Toronto Maple Leafs, and a colleague from the Calgary Flames, Chris Snow, who have both been diagnosed with ALS.
Help end ALS.
Fight ALS.
The battle against ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, needs our help.
And we ask for your help.
Let's champion the cause and work towards a cure.
ALS, with the knowledge that we have, the great doctors we have, the way our communities across the country band together and help people who are in a crisis, the strength and the willpower that the victims and their families have, I know we can get closer and closer to finding a cure for this deadly disease.
There is much work to be done, and as you can see, we have the support of many. As a group, we are doing amazing advocacy.
Well done, Mark, and please go to alsactioncanada.org to to find out how you can join the fight. That's it for Hockey Time Machine this week. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. I'm Glenn Dreyfus. Good night.